Many people are aware that trauma impacts us emotionally, but might be unaware of how much it impacts our brains. It can literally cause brain damage and change the way our brain functions. Let's talk about that.
Have you ever wondered, can trauma and PTSD actually cause literal brain damage? The answer, in short, is yes. Neuropathologists have seen overlapping effects of physical and emotional trauma upon the brain. According to recent studies, trauma and PTSD cause both physical and emotional or brain damage. However, emotional trauma to the brain is not the same as a traumatic brain injury. A TBI usually involves a physical injury that causes long-lasting or permanent damage to the brain. Scientists have proven that neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, can sometimes override the impacts of trauma with the help of a skilled trauma specialist. Moreover, one's environment and choices can either help or hinder this process when recovering from PTSD. PTSD is characterized by specific symptoms including intrusive thoughts, hyperarousal, flashbacks, nightmares, sleep disturbances, changes in memory and concentration, and an overactive startle response. Stress-induced changes in the brain create the behavioral manifestations of PTSD. Stress results in chronic changes in neurochemical systems and specific brain regions. Eventually, long-term changes occur in the brain circuits involved in the stress response. Both the physical and emotional damage from trauma have a detrimental effect upon the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex of the brain. Trauma and the amygdala. Excessive worrying, restless energy, irritability, and trouble focusing are all linked to an overactive amygdala. These physiological changes are often the result of a fight-flight response occurring more frequently than normal or in response to situations that aren't really dangerous. This is one of the main symptoms of anxiety disorders. The amygdala is comprised of nervous tissue in the brain that is responsible for our emotions, our survival instincts, and our memories. One of the functions of the amygdala is to detect fear. It observes and records information around us to determine if there is danger present. Using our senses, such as sight and sound, the amygdala will respond with the feeling of fear if it perceives the threat. This all happens unconsciously deep in our brains. However, when affected by PTSD, the amygdala becomes hyperactive. Compromises in the amygdala can manifest as chronic stress, heightened fear, and increased irritation. These brain changes can also make it harder for those suffering to calm down following an upsetting event or even to get a good night's sleep. Someone with an overactive amygdala is more likely to rely on avoidance coping, which involves avoiding people, places, or situations that trigger their stress or anxiety. Avoidance is a symptom often associated with anxiety disorders, specific phobias, and PTSD. While the amygdala is one part of the brain's limbic system, there are other brain areas that have different jobs relating to processing emotions. One of these is the hippocampus, which is mainly responsible for learning new things and storing memories. Trauma and the hippocampus. The hippocampus is part of the brain's limbic system. It is mainly responsible for storing and retrieving memories. Additionally, it helps differentiate between past and present. Studies have shown that in people suffering from PTSD, the volume of their hippocampus may be even smaller than average. The hippocampus is one of the brain areas involved in verbal declarative memory. This area of the brain is very sensitive to the effects of stress. High levels of glucocorticoids seen with stress are also associated with deficits in new learning. In addition, patients with PTSD show increased cortisol and norepinephrine responses to stress. Long-term dysregulation of the HPA axis is associated with PTSD, along with low levels of cortisol. Exposure to a traumatic reminder may trigger a release of cortisol. This is because the victim cannot differentiate between their past trauma and the current situation. The fight-flight response is then activated because the brain is perceiving danger in the present. Because the hippocampus plays a role in emotion regulation, it also has an impact on a person's mood. This may be why traumatic experiences increase the risk of developing mood disorders like depression. This is especially true for survivors of childhood trauma who are 3 times more likely to develop depression. The hippocampus also helps manage stress. Research has shown that trauma survivors are more likely to report struggling with chronic stress. They may also have higher baseline levels of stress than most. Having a lower stress tolerance makes a person more easily upset or overwhelmed, even when faced with minor issues and problems. Impaired hippocampal regions may lead to a decrease in one's ability to manage emotions and stress in positive ways. This can make a person more likely to use unhealthy coping methods. For example, studies have shown that people with high levels of trauma are more likely to smoke, drink, and adopt unhealthy eating and exercise patterns. The prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex performs most of the complex thinking processes known as executive functions. Executive functions include the ability to plan ahead, think things through, and make well thought out choices, all of which are imperative skills for everyday life. Trauma can suppress the prefrontal cortex, leading to impaired executive functioning. When people are in fight-flight mode, the prefrontal cortex becomes less active and survival instincts take over. When traumatic stress happens frequently, too early in life, or for extended periods of time, it can lead to long-lasting impairments in executive functions. Studies have shown that people with PTSD have lower executive functioning than the general population. Damage to the prefrontal cortex can cause someone to make riskier decisions. They may experience stronger urges to make poor choices and have less of an ability to resist them. This may explain why people with trauma histories have higher rates of impulsivity. Decreased executive functioning also makes it harder to consider long-term goals and the consequences of one's actions. Because the prefrontal cortex helps people think logically, analyze information, and solve problems, damage to this part of the brain is often linked to learning problems. Poor grades, difficulty memorizing, or trouble grasping new concepts can all be the result of trauma. Trouble focusing is both a short and long-term effect of trauma. The prefrontal cortex is a necessary component of concentrated attention, so impairments in this region of the brain may manifest as symptoms of brain fog, ADD, or ADHD. A variety of therapies have proven effective in the treatment of trauma, and some can provide relief after a few sessions. These trauma-informed therapies include EMDR or MEMI, cognitive processing therapy or CBT, prolonged exposure therapy, and movement practice. Healing from trauma is an individualized process that is different for everyone. A number of factors can affect how quickly a person recovers or which treatments they will respond well to. No matter what methods of trauma treatment you decide to try, it is very important to develop a network of people to support your recovery. If you do not currently have the encouragement and resources you need, please join our online group to find understanding, friendship, and community. If you are new to your healing journey and are simply trying to get a good grasp on what's happened to you and how to recover, this is a great place to start. However, real lasting trauma recovery often requires treatment from a trauma specialist or other professional.
Listen, I've been there, and I know that this stuff can be really hard, but there are so many resources to help you through it. If I can help you in any way, please reach out.